There probably are some laws of physics at the micro level that would explain everything that's going on in your head right now, but in no way would that undermine the idea that you're a thinker. Let's look at the arguments for and against LLM minds and make sure we're not using any that are going to undercut the obvious truth that we all have minds as well.
I don't think any of us writing the paper feel that LLMs straightforwardly have exactly the same type of mental states as we do. So often debates around LLMs, it seems like either they're just autocomplete stochastic parrots, matrix multiplication, or they're full-blown human thinkers, when the answer is going to be something in between. They're this weird new class of cognitive agents we've created.
ChatGPT sometimes expresses beliefs and desires, and occasionally even claims to be conscious. But is this just a reflection of the data it was trained on? My guests today argue it's actually quite plausible that large language models like ChatGPT not only understand what they're writing, but they may have beliefs, desires, intentions, or even consciousness. Alex Grzankowski is a philosopher at King's College London, working on mind, language, metaphysics, and epistemology. Welcome, Alex.
Happy to be here. Thanks, Ruben.
And Henry Shevlin is a philosopher.
Henry Shevlin!
And Henry Shevlin is a philosopher and AI ethicist at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge. Welcome, Henry.
Thank you. Lovely to be here. And we're laughing because just before we started recording, we were joking about how half my mail is sent to Henry Shevlin rather than Henry Shevlin. I've been introduced on national TV as Henry Shevlin. So you're following familiar footsteps there, Ruben.
Yeah, and I think this example will actually come out later on as a way in which humans fail to exhibit certain cognitive capacities. All right, so what are some of the worst arguments you've heard against LLMs having mental states? Perhaps, Alex, you could start.
Well, I think that one of the really bad ones is something just like they're just next word predictors. Therefore, they can't think, they can't have minds, they can't be conscious, and so on.
Okay, but it is true that they are next token predictors.
I think it's absolutely right that one of the things they do is predict next token, and that one of the ways in which they accomplish lots of other tasks is by producing next token. But there are lots of things that we do by doing other things. And so there's no sort of immediate, easy inference from it does this, therefore that's not a way of doing this other thing. It might be, for example, that I put one foot in front of the other, and that's a way of getting to the bus. So we should be open to the possibility that predicting the next token is a way of doing some of these other more interesting things.
And how about you, Henry? What are some of the worst arguments?
Well, yeah, as I'll just quickly build on something Alex said. Firstly, I think the next token predictor characterization of LLMs is itself a little bit outdated if we're being sticklers, because obviously these models are now fine-tuned through techniques like reinforcement learning through human feedback to not just predict the most likely word, to predict the most likely word given certain other constraints, right? So that's kind of a stickler point, but I think it's an important one. These are unless you're dealing with base models, these are not next token predictors anyway. And yeah, related to Alex, I think there's a lot of characterizations of LLMs that say, oh, it's just matrix multiplication or something like that. And again, building on what Alex said, look, you can characterize any cognitive system according to multiple levels of description. If we want to be proper and technical about it, we might go to someone like David Marr, who distinguished between different ways you can characterize a system at the implementational levels. What is the hardware or wetware doing? The algorithmic level, what are the fine-grained computational processes that are happening? And then the top level, the computational level, or I think more helpfully characterized sometimes as the functional level, which is, what is the behavior for? What is the task it's accomplishing, right? So look, you can give a multi-level description of what's going on in humans. Oh, you're not really in love. It's just your anterior cingulate gyrus, coalitions of neurons firing there. Or at a computational level, you're minimizing some kind of loss over a certain kind of computational structure. But none of this excludes the possibility of high-level psychological descriptions. Now, the fact that we can characterize LLMs as, doing matrix multiplication or whatever, obviously doesn't mean that there is an appropriate psychological level, but I don't think it excludes it either. If I was going to add one additional bad argument, just because it's one that comes up, the counting the R's in strawberry and other kinds of tasks. I think, or a lot of the tasks that basically involve tokenization issues, I think they're just mean and unfair on LLMs, because LLMs don't really speak English, right? They speak tokens. And so tasks that require them to translate back and forth between English and tokens have a significantly harder for them than similar tasks would be for us.
So maybe for people who haven't heard that, if you ask ChatGPT, or it probably does it now, but early versions of LLMs, how many R's there are in strawberry, it would often miscount them. And people said, how stupid are these LLMs? They can't even count the number of R's in strawberry. But the fact is that these LLMs are trained not with letters, but with tokens, which are subsets of words, chunks of words. And so the word strawberry might be 3 chunks, STRA, WB, and then ERI. And so it's actually quite hard for it to infer how many R's there are when it can't see the R's. It can only see the chunks of the words.
So one analogy I think I've used for this is, imagine you've memorized translations of every text ever written in Chinese. And then someone asks you, how many times does the character moon occur in the word, committee, right? It's like, it would be very, very hard, unless you've read texts that specifically talk about which characters occur with what frequency, specific Chinese words, unless you're lucky enough to have that, it'd be very, very hard to reverse engineer that problem. Now, it's a little bit easier for LLMs. In theory, they could work backwards. There's no information lost. They could work backwards from tokens to text, but I think that's a useful analogy, right? In some sense, they're not really seeing the individual letters.
Mm-hmm.
Often people will reach in comparative cognitive science and psychology for the mirror test, and they'll ask things like, can a child recognize itself in a mirror? Can a gorilla recognize itself in the mirror? And then dogs don't do that well on this task. And so now we might conclude something like, oh, dogs don't have a self-conception, or dogs don't recognize themselves. But it turns out if you swap out a mirror and do a sort of nuanced test where they can smell themselves, they pass the equivalent test without any trouble. It's just a matter of, what are they most sensitive to? What sort of sensory apparatus is the one that they use for this kind of task? But to think that, like, aha, look, we've shown that they're these dogs are idiots. It's like, well, we didn't give them a very good test given their capabilities.
Absolutely. That's a fantastic example. There's another similar thing with dolphins not passing the mirror test, when it turned out to be the way their eyes worked and refraction worked in water. And when you actually make the task ecologically valid, then dolphins can do just fine. Also, fun fact, at least some kind of analogs of the mirror test, LLMs can pass. So if you take a photo of ongoing chat with ChatGPT, upload it to ChatGPT and ask, what is this a photo of? It's not 100% reliable, but very frequently it will say things like, oh, that looks like you've just taken a photo of the conversation we're having right now, which is kind of cool.
So the general lesson here is, if an LLM fails to exhibit some cognitive capacity in some specific case, that doesn't mean it doesn't have that capacity at all. It might just be that it's context specific or has to be presented in the right way.
Yeah, a slight tweak, I would say behavioral. So if it doesn't meet some behavioral task, we shouldn't conclude from the failure on an isolated behavioral task to the absence of a given cognitive capability.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the exact same standard we would hold any other animal in comparative cognitive science or psychology. So I just think, if we're even entertaining the possibility that we're dealing with something with psychological features, like, why shouldn't we apply the same kinds of metrics and tests that we're using across animal species? Why would it be, what's supposed to be so special about machines that one screw up on strawberry all of a sudden rules them out?
It's quite interesting because I wrote a paper back with a colleague, Marta Helena. We wrote a paper for Nature Machine Intelligence back in 2019, where we were criticizing machine learning researchers politely for not living up to the same standards of proof as comparative cognition researchers, i.e. being way too eager to attribute mental capabilities, or at least use psychological terms like agency, creativity, understanding to describe systems without putting them through the same kind of tests or analysis that we'd put animals through. And I still think it's important to hold them to the same standard, but I almost feel in a lot of discourse around ML, it's kind of, the debate has flipped, where we're now holding LLMs to a higher standard than we would equivalent non-human animals.
Maybe to push back on that, I imagine a lot of people listening to this podcast will start off with the conception of an LLM is literally just code running on a computer. Like, why would you think that code could have beliefs or other mental states like desires or even consciousness? You're like fundamentally confused about what you're talking about.
I mean, I think there's just a really important question about sort of where you get started with this mental attribution in general. Like, it's really easy and obvious for me to think that you, Ruben, have a mind and that you, Henry, have a mind. But then if I reflect on sort of why do I think that, I think very quickly then things start to look a lot murkier and a lot more complicated. I don't know, do I think it because you've got two arms and two legs? Well, no, definitely not. We all know that that's not a requirement for having a mind. Do I think it because you've got eyes, ears, and a mouth? No. Do I think it's because you're made of the same stuff as me? Maybe. Maybe that has something to do with it. But I kind of think that when push comes to shove, what it comes down to is something like, well, you seem to exhibit a certain kind of coherence in your behavior. You've got certain kind of problem solving capabilities. You seem to have some interests that you're trying to carry out. And that's the exact same kind of thing I would then apply to a cat or a dog. And then if you give me an earthworm or a cricket, I might be a little bit less sure. And so it seems like it's a mix of sort of inference to the best explanation and looking at behavioral evidence and the sort of ways that creatures deal with their environment. And then when we're presented with something like an LLM, I think it's really easy to think like, oh, well, this thing's just running on a computer, therefore it must not have a mind. But I mean, why shouldn't I think something like an octopus brain is organized way different than mine, therefore it doesn't have a mind? Or look, earthworms don't have any limbs, therefore they don't have a mind. I mean, it's just completely non-obvious that those differences are ones that make a difference. And so I think that when we chat with an LLM, it sure looks like it's doing some of the kinds of things that would tip me off in other cases to there being a mind here. That doesn't mean that there is a mind here, but it gives me, I think, sort of first mover advantage to say, like, it kind of looks like there is. So why shouldn't I think that things are just as they seem?
So I can see that this shows that there's evidence that they have a mind, but it's still reasonable to have a lower prior belief, to come to the situation thinking, well, it doesn't have a brain like humans do, and obviously the limbs aren't what's required for mental states, but a brain is sure required for mental states, at least in humans. And so things that have brains are more likely to have mental states, and things that don't have brains are less likely to have mental states.
So I think the underlying argumentative structure here is something. I think, obviously this is kind of an intuitive first pass argument. It's something like what philosopher Michael Tye has called Newton's rule, which is basically we should assign the same causes to the same effects. So when we see a dog yelp and withdraw a paw from a harmful stimulus, well, we know if we did that, that would be caused by pain. So we should assume the same thing for the dog. And underpinning this is something like an appeal to similarity. So dogs are pretty similar to us, so we should assign the same kinds of causes to the same kinds of effects. But then I think the difficulty in this is, well, how do you make objective judgments of similarity, right? LLMs are in some ways more similar to us than animals in the sense that they're highly efficient language users. I can talk, I've tried having conversations about philosophy with dogs, and they don't generally, they're pretty shallow. They don't go very far. Whereas I can have elaborate conversations about philosophy with LLMs. So the question is which kinds of similarities we assign which kind of weighting to. Yes, non-human animals have brains. Yes, they have bodies and so forth, but LLMs don't have those things, but they're also very proficient language users. They have a lot of common knowledge, they can talk about a lot of the same kinds of things as us. So I do think the fact that something has a brain should marginally increase our credence that its given behavioral effects are caused by similar psychological causes. But I also think language capabilities should do the same thing. And trying to figure out which of those to weight and how much, you inevitably end up basically, I don't want to say begging certain theoretical questions, but certainly making certain theoretical assumptions if you want to turn that into anything like a theory of which beings have minds and which don't.
I mean, this is the argument that machines can't be conscious in general. But another way of thinking about what an LLM is that it's a very complicated mathematical formula that a machine then executes. And you could execute this formula by hand. If you had the patience, you could calculate by hand what an LLM was going to spit out next. So it seems even more absurd to say that a formula could have mental states.
I think it seems right that a formula isn't going to have mental states, but a thing which is properly described as computing through loads and loads and loads of functions, or I think that takes us back to to where we started, where you asked what's a bad argument, and I think it's something like the mere fact that we can describe this unfolding of events in those sort of low-level mathematical terms just in no way should exclude the possibility of there being true and correct higher level explanations. I mean, I think it's very likely that those sorts of things will be true for us too, but they in no way impugn me thinking you have a mind or that Henry has a mind. There probably are some laws of physics at the micro level that would explain everything that's going on in your head right now, but in no way would that undermine the idea that you're a thinker.
Yeah. So if I ask an LLM, how are you feeling today? And it responds, I'm good. It's tempting to say that the LLM feels good, like the computer running the LLM feels good. But given that an LLM is just a mathematical formula that I could execute by hand, suppose I also executed it by hand and I get the output, I'm good. It seems hard to understand like what is having any experience there, or what is having values or beliefs there, given I'm just calculating by hand a mathematical formula.
Yeah, good. Okay. I mean, I think there are two sort of really important things to draw out of that thought. One is that simply computing that function by hand may be importantly different than computing it in a way that's organized in a certain kind of a kind of structure where information is being shared and passed around in the right kind of way. I mean, I think that that's probably true for the human brain too. It may well be that we could sort of calculate by hand the sort of computational processes that a visual system goes through, but that wouldn't make the piece of paper and the pen have eyes and see. It needs to be caused in the right way. It needs to be organized in the right way. It needs to have the right effects. But I also think that it's important I mean, I'd kind of like to just put myself on the record. I don't know if where Henry stands on this. I think the really important thing here is to make sure that we're being careful about why it is that we think that LLMs have minds or don't have minds. I'm not sort of a sort of card carrying like LLMs are conscious beings. They believe that grass is green, and in the case that you gave, they feel good. It's that I want to rule out their having minds on the basis of good reasons. And I think that a lot of the arguments that are given against LLMs having minds are pretty weak and need refining. I used to teach philosophy of religion in the States to students, and I would always give them this argument from the banana for the existence of God, because it was a manifestly horrible argument where this person would say, like, look at the banana. It's like so perfectly fit for your hand and it opens up so easily. And like only God could design such a thing. But of course, the like banana that you buy in a grocery store is massively influenced by human genetic choice. And so it was a terrible argument. And what I wanted students to take away from that is that if you're a theist, if you want to argue for God's existence and you want to argue against the atheist position, like make sure you have good arguments and not crap arguments. And so, I don't really care where you land. Just make sure you land there for good reason. So I think the same thing in this case. I think that it's really a question about what are the good arguments for and against, rather than what's the right conclusion here. That's kind of my first stopping point. When we're thinking about the case of producing the output, I feel good. I think one of the things that would invite people to entertain is that it's not that LLMs, I'm not inclined to think that the LLM there, when it says I am good, therefore has the mental state of like, I feel good. But I think that the more interesting question is, does an LLM have any kind of mental states at all along the way to producing its outputs? And it might be that what it does is think about direct objects and noun phrases, or it might be that it thinks about how tokens relate to other tokens, or it might be that it believes grass is green and Paris is in France. Or like, I think we should be very open-minded about the kinds of things that it might be representing and computing and that might constitute thinking. And those may or may not be as complicated as the kind of like, I feel good, even though the output is I feel good. So I think we need to tease those apart and start at sort of like quite a low bar.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Alex has just said. I think I would also slightly push back on some of the framing, Ruben. I think the interesting question is not, do LLMs have minds, but which mental states, if any, it's reasonable to attribute to them on the basis of their behavior. So I completely agree with Alex that like probably don't take I'm feeling good at face value. Helpful analogy here that I was heard from Jeff Sebo is you can think of LLMs like an actor, right? So when you see an actor on stage say, my soul is full of woe, should we conclude that the actor is thereby really sad? No. However, there are mental states you can reasonably attribute to the actor that probably don't rely on the exact words they're saying, but rather on their broader competencies. A couple of other little points, because I think that is a really rich question you asked that had a few different strands. So there was this kind of predictability question, the fact that should we conclude from the fact that you might be able to sort of run the maths and figure out what an LLM would output in a given situation, to what extent should that undermine our restrictions of mentality? And of course, this is taking us into big classic debates around determinism and so forth. Famously, there's this example of Laplace's demon. Imagine you had a demon that could freeze the state of the universe, and just using the complete knowledge of physics, extrapolate the future state of the universe, the earlier state of the universe, sort of a classic determinist argument against free will. Obviously, quantum mechanics, which makes everything tricky, but sort of if that was in principle impossible, well, maybe that would undermine free will if you're what we call a hard determinist, but it shouldn't undermine the presence or absence of mental states. A really good little reading recommendation for any listeners who want a nice 1 hour read on this topic. I really recommend Doug Hofstadter's A Dialogue with Einstein's Brain, where he basically imagines that we create a book. We take Einstein's brain at the moment of his death, turn it into a book that records the state of every neuron, every synapse. If you want to get really fine-grained, we could talk about sort of intracellular states, and turns them into matrices and vectors and so forth. And then in the dialogue, we're invited to say, oh, you can talk to the book, right? Because you just sort of run the maths to figure out what changes would be evinced if Einstein heard you say, hey, Einstein, how are you doing today? You update the numbers, update the columns, and extrapolate from that, what his response would be. I think that's a nice way of framing that question. The other thing that was buried in your question, and I'm just going to throw this out there, I'm not going to answer it, is you say who's having the experience. I think there really are super interesting questions about sort of personal identity in LLMs, but I think they're broadly orthogonal to questions of whether mental states are there in the first place.
If you take this argument seriously, that being able to run the numbers and see what an LLM would output means that it can't possibly have mental states, then you should also apply this argument to humans. If you had some superior being with loads of time on his hands that fully understood the laws of physics, he could predict what I was going to say next. But that we don't assume that the fact that that's true rules out me having mental states.
Yeah, that seems exactly right. And I mean, I think that there's a way in which that's kind of a helpful thing to keep coming back to, which is something like, I mean, one approach that we could take is to just be very skeptical about any other minds other than our own. I might just think it's obvious I have a mind, but I'm completely skeptical that you have a mind because I could do this physics calculation. But I think that seems like a pretty wacky place to start. I think a much more reasonable place to start is of course other humans have minds. That's just obvious. That's just a given. It's not that there's no context in which I would question that, but for my usual inquiry, that's a freebie. Given that that's a freebie, what sorts of arguments are supposed to be undermining? We don't want to undermine that. Let's look at the arguments for and against LLM minds and make sure we're not using any that are going to undercut the obvious truth that we all have minds as well.
Yeah, it better not. Your argument better not prove that humans are not conscious as well. One other argument that people might come to this conversation with is that LLMs are essentially just stochastic parrots. They reflect back the claims and the sentences that were in their training data in a scrambled up way that's cleverly designed to mimic answers to your question. And then they might say, well, okay, asking whether an LLM reflecting back sentences from the training data, asking whether that has mental states is like asking whether a mirror has mental states or your reflection has mental states. Again, it's a kind of confusion about what the technology is.
I mean, I think that sounds like a bit of a confusion about what the technology is, because it's just not. I mean, it's just not correct that what LLMs are doing is going and dragging sentences out of their training data and copy and pasting them. The mere fact that we've got generative models, I think, already takes us. It doesn't yet take us all the way away from sort of a kind of parrot problem. I think there may be a real problem there, but a sort of mirror strikes me as something where we're supposed to be finding this kind of just go grab some training data, move it over, put it into the output. But a generative model is already not doing just that. And so it's already more interesting than that. Now, there might be other reasons that you think it's a parrot, but I think that in the first instance, that strikes me as, I know, a mistake that I think you probably wouldn't make in earnest, Ruben. But I think someone offering that thought, if what they have in mind is that this thing is kind of like a giant copy-paste machine, that's just not correct.
I'd also add that I think there's humans are a little bit parroty in some ways. If you spend any time on Twitter or talking to undergraduates, you'll quickly realize like half of what we're doing in conversation is regurgitating half-remembered talking points we've heard from someone else. Now, I think you can say, and what the stochastic parrot defender would say here is, but when we do it, it's different, right? But that's because they're baking in some theoretical assumptions about the appropriate mechanisms for having a mind that we have, that LLMs don't. In other words, they're just begging the question against their opponents.
I mean, I think on that front, like the thing I would just want to ask that person is, I'm very open to them being different. As Henry was saying earlier, there's sort of different ways of being similar, different ways of being different. Of course it's different, but is it a difference that matters? Tell me the way in which it's different so that I should conclude, and therefore it's not thinking, therefore it's not mindedness.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of these debunking arguments are of the form, an LLM is just something. An LLM is just the next token predictor, or it's just matrix multiplication. And you say that this, in general, is a bad argument. Could you explain your reasoning there?
I mean, I guess I have in mind just again, drawing on the sort of parallel with people. I mean, we're just neurotransmitters and neural firing pattern thingies. I mean, that just, what do you mean just? One of the things driving lion behavior is, procreate. So they're just procreators. I think, well, no, of course not. They're also hunters. They're also parents. They're also, you sort of go across lots of different cases and you think like these just arguments, I don't really even understand exactly how they're supposed to work, really, unless you have the following kind of worldview, which I think most people don't really have on reflection. The only thing that is part of reality is the absolute lowest physical level of description. Everything else after that is just fiction. You can have that view, but if you have that view, I think LLMs should be like on the periphery of your interest. Like you should now be interested in like, and therefore there are no tables, therefore there are no chairs, therefore there are no people, therefore there are no children, therefore, and that just all seems completely bananas.
Yeah, I'd add there's one of my favorite sort of bad examples of public reporting of science that I've used with students before is there's I think a New York Post headline or something that says, scientists find out that love isn't real. It's just your nucleus accumbens and your dopamine system. And it's like, can you figure out what's gone wrong here? And I think it's basically the same error in some of these LLMs are just X strategies, right? Yeah, you can describe them in that level, but it doesn't exclude other levels.
I mean, I think it's like, it's easy to see how silly this is. And I mean, for what it's worth, I think there's some really interesting philosophical arguments that might suggest this is not silly, but it seems silly. There are no tables because they're just made up of particles. You just think like, is that really like, that's how we want to argue? We can argue that way. I can see wheeling that thought out. But if we do that, we will go the way of what in metaphysics is called the nihilist, about composition, the person who just thinks like all there are is particles. That's it. I think we could have that worldview, but I think that that's a very strange place to sort of start our worldview from.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So Henry, you touched earlier on this idea that an LLM is a kind of actress, the world's best improv artist that can play any character. If an LLM does have beliefs or mental states or desires, then we shouldn't assume they are the mental states that it expresses when we chat to it, because they're always role-playing. I mean, when you chat to ChatGPT, it's instructed to role-play as a helpful AI assistant. So if they do have these kind of beliefs or preferences, could you give us a picture of what they might be?
Yeah, so this is where I think things get interesting and hard. I think on the one hand, granting that attribution of some kinds of mental states to LLMs are not ruled out at the outset, but also recognizing that we shouldn't take them quite at face value. I think this actually really struck me reading the transcripts of Blake Lemoine's conversations with Lambda. So Blake Lemoine, as I'm sure some of your listeners will know, was the Google engineer who was fired in summer 2022 when he went public with claims that the Lambda model he was interacting with was conscious. And if you read the transcripts of the conversations, it's really intoxicating because this model, unlike sort of the later models we interact with, had not been specifically fine-tuned to deny being conscious or deny having mental states, right? So it talks at great length about its inner world and its inner experiences. And then as the conversation goes on, it starts to talk about its bodily sensations and, the tightness of its heart and its chest. And at that point, for me anyway, it's like, okay. At that point, the curtain has slipped and it's clear it's doing improv, essentially. In terms of what kinds of beliefs and preferences to attribute to an LLM. I think, yeah, it's going to be tricky in individual cases. And if I had to give one slightly crude example, like I think we can attribute to LLMs strong preferences against saying racial slurs, for example. They've been RLHF'd hell into really not wanting to do that, and I think that's a kind of candidate basic preference. I also think it's really interesting that Anthropic has given Claude the ability to terminate conversations now. This is partly a welfare measure, partly a safety measure. But I think, for example, to the extent that we find Claude reliably terminates conversations with certain kinds of content, I think we can begin to attribute some kind of preference against having those conversations towards it. Not to say a conscious preference or an effectively laden one, but I don't think the term preference, as used in English as a psychological descriptor, necessarily has to carry the idea of consciousness or affect with it.
But aren't these preferences just a reflection of the training data about what the LLM thinks an AI system, based on its readings of science fiction or whatever, ought to say or ought to prefer in a given situation?
I mean, again, human preferences, don't come from nowhere. They're acquired through our interactions with the world, information we have from teachers, role models, and so forth, or just, brute conditioning. So again, I'd be skeptical that there's a really deep disanalogy there.
I mean, it might be too that I think Henry started to sort of gesture at this, is we might think something like, oh, it kind of looks like preference behavior, but it's not really preferences. This is, again, a place where I've got a lot of sympathy with that thought, but I want to know, but what is it exactly that takes us from preference behavior to, yes, but it's undermined somehow? And is it that maybe they don't have consciousness? And I think, okay, it's not obvious to me that preferences have to come with a rich experience. Does it have to be that preferences come with a self-conception of what it is that you want? No, probably not. Is it that preferences have to be tied up with let's say, a worldview or a religion or no, I don't think so. And now all that stuff's true in most of us. It's I am both something with intentions and preferences and consciousness and beliefs and an outlook, and those things are all kind of mashed together. But do they have to always come together? Might there be a sort of simplistic way of thinking about, or even maybe just a kind of purely functional way? What does it do? What is it that preferences do? That we could then ask, like, do LLMs have preferences in some minimal sense? I think that's got to be at least an important avenue to explore, in addition to this kind of, like rich conscious life that adult humans have.
I guess I'd add that I think there are some good examples from the natural world here. We routinely attribute preferences to a wide range of animals without necessarily thereby assuming that they're conscious, right? We can talk about, in biological or zoological terms, about the preferences of different insect species, or even the preferences of plants. Like, this plant really prefers not to grow in acidic soil. Now, the counter move is to say, but we're slipping into metaphorical or figurative language when we talk about the preferences of plants. Not clear that we are, to me. It really, I think that's something you've got to argue for. In fact, Carrie Figdor, a fantastic philosopher, has argued that there's ubiquitous use of the term preferences in neuroscience to refer to the behaviors of individual neurons. And she has argued at length, partly through quite detailed linguistic analysis, that this is not intended figuratively by neuroscientists, and we should understand talk of neuronal preferences as literal instantiations of the word preference. Now, that's maybe quite an extreme position, but yeah, I think it's the kind of move that, it's just metaphorical when we talk about the preferences of plants, is one that I think really requires some heavy-duty argument.
Yeah, so I agree that a lot of these additional requirements, like being conscious or having self-awareness or experiencing the preference in some phenomenological sense, are not really necessary. But I'm worried that if you start stripping these things away, you end up with such a liberal usage of the terminology that you end up having to say things like, a chess engine wants to win the game, or a rock wants to roll downhill. How do you prevent yourself from making those kind of statements?
I mean, I think that's in a way, a really nice way of putting the other bookend on the kind of question here. One is, where do you want to start? Do you want to start with the idea that, for all I know, maybe other humans don't have minds at all? I think, no, we don't realistically want to start there. And where do you want to end? Do you want to end with, maybe rocks have preferences? And I think some people might surprisingly say yes to that, but I'm certainly of the view, no, Obviously not. And so now the name of the game is, what are the considerations for and against that land us in a sort of reasonable place, recognizing that there are going to be gray areas kind of at the periphery. I'm not really sure what to say about a worm or a cricket or whatever. And I'm not really sure what to say about a certain kind of complex plant. But I'm definitely going to say humans are a yes, and I'm definitely going to say rocks are a no. If I start with that as my sort of data, what are the kinds of arguments that successfully allow me to uphold the middle position? And I don't think it's sort of obvious just what to say there. I think that the interesting sort of the philosopher's interesting thing is to appreciate that that space ought to be inhabited. And now which are the arguments that successfully keep us there, and which are the ones that would push us out into the absurd positions? And if they push us out to the absurd positions, don't utilize them, don't wield them. And I think that a lot of the arguments against LLM mentality land us in those absurd places, and so they aren't very good arguments. But I certainly feel the pull of, if we're not careful about how thin we go on this, we people like Henry and me are going to end up attributing consciousness and mentality and beliefs and intentions to rocks. I don't want to speak for Henry, but I certainly don't want to end up in that position. And so it's important to me that my arguments are ones that are constrained in that way. How to constrain them? Complicated.
I would add that, despite some lingering Aristotelianism from my early education, I also want to deny that rocks have preferences. But I would say, I think, Dennett's intentional stance is a pretty good way of figuring out when it's appropriate to apply psychological terminology to anything. In other words, how much explanatory purchase does it give you, right? How much easier is it to understand the behavior of a system by invoking basic belief desire psychology or preferences or representations? If the answer is it makes it a whole lot easier to predict what it's going to do next, then to the extent that it does, that justifies the application of preferences. I always think there's maybe some, to my view, slightly confused metaphysics in the background here. If we think of preferences, I think a lot of people think of all mental states as sort of in very kind of atomic realist terms, like either there is a preference for X in your head right now, or there is not. And if we cracked open your skull and used the right kind of scientific instrumentation, we could either find it or we wouldn't. That is a view, of course, that you can adopt, but it's one that I find really unpersuasive. I think preferences should be seen as sort of explanatory functions from behavior, from observed behavior to future behavior, something like that. We invoke the idea of preferences to the extent as they help us interpret and predict what's going to happen next. And that means that LLMs sometimes, I think in the case of LLMs, sometimes it is massively useful to think of them as beings with goals, representations, beliefs, perhaps, and so forth.
I think maybe that's a place where Henry and I probably almost agree, but I think I'm less inclined to think that the intentional stance is the right approach, because I think the Dennett's intentional stance does probably allow us to say things like thermostats have beliefs. That's not obviously a bad thing, but it seems to me like we pushed too far. And so, I mean, I think that I would be more inclined to say there have to be the right kinds of computational states. There have to be the right kinds of representational states. I certainly see the worry that Henry has that we don't want to have the view that you're always going to find a little thingy that goes with believes that grass is green or whatever. But I do think that there are going to be kinds of constraints on systems that they're organized in the right way, they're functioning internally in the right kind of way, and that they've got the right kind of computational profile. And I think there are pretty good ways of ruling out rocks from computing anything. Now, there are worries about pan-computationalism that people have raised, but I think those can be handled. So I'm quite inclined to tie mindedness to a certain kind of representational or information processing system, and I think rocks are ruled out by going down that kind of path. And I think the intentional stance is a really nice view, but it might let in too much by my lights.
I would say that in the case of the thermostat, just sort of channeling Dennett here a little bit, you can explain the thermostat's behavior satisfactorily in terms of the design stance. So the key move here is not just does the intentional stance not only does it have to give you predictive power and explanatory power, it has to give you predictive and explanatory power that can't be had more cheaply elsewhere, right? So in the case of a thermostat, you can explain its behavior by saying, look, here's what it's designed to do, rather than appeal to psychological capacities.
If I understand this correctly, Dennett's intentional stance says that you should treat something as having beliefs, for example, if you are much more able to explain its behavior by making that assumption. But the problem I have with this argument is we've now moved from is there a fact of the matter about whether it indeed has beliefs to is it useful to model it as having beliefs? And that's a very different question.
I think it's the same question, right? I think that's how I do my ontology, right? You should believe in stuff, in anything, whether that's species, evolution, gravity, and so forth, to the extent that by positing it, you are better able to understand and structure your experiences. That doesn't mean it's not real. That's just giving an account of, what the epistemic standards are for thinking that something is real. And to the extent that employing the intentional stance towards systems, whether LLMs, animals, or whatever, allows us to better understand, explain, predict what's happening in the world, to that extent, we should be committed to the reality of the ascriptions, right? That doesn't mean that they're sort of, these thingies, these real independent thingies. But, what it means for something to have a belief on this view is to fit a certain behavioral profile. With one other caveat I would just throw in here, which is that this isn't an all or nothing matter. I think once you switch to this more kind of interpretationist, I think robust interpretationalist kind of position, then things can have, what Dennett loves to call like kinda beliefs, i.e. States that sort of fit our belief-like profile in some ways and maybe not in others. So it's not necessarily a binary, yes, they do, yes, they don't. It's like, yeah, they have something that it's useful for us to think of as belief-like in many contexts, maybe not in all.
If I could just add to that quickly, I think I'm probably a little less interpretationist, pragmatist leaning maybe than Henry is. And I think despite, I think it's interesting that two people, along with two other people who were co-authors on the paper we wrote together, we probably, all four of us have sort of different underlying metaphysical approaches. But I think I'm a bit more sort of robust realist in my metaphysics. And nevertheless, I think that when it comes to these questions about LLMs, I tend to agree very broadly with Henry. So I kind of feel the pull, Ruben, maybe more than Henry does, of that question of like, it kind of sounds like now we're just talking about, well, what is explanatorily fruitful for us? Why should I take that as a guide to reality? And I think that there's an important kind of inference to the best explanation step that gets you from that to realism that goes beyond the interpretationist. It's something like, this theory that posits electrons does really well, therefore, explanatorily, therefore they're electrons. I think that's not quite the way I would do it. I think I would say something like, what's the best explanation for why a theory that posits electrons keeps giving us good results? Because there really are electrons there, because it's true. Now, how much space or distance there is between these two worldviews, I'm not sure. But I kind of think like, it's interesting to me that I've got quite realist leanings. It sounds to me, Henry and I haven't really had a discussion about our sort of deep underlying metaphysics before, but it sounds to me like Henry might be slightly a bit more pragmatist. And nevertheless, I think we still think that these issues about LLMs are very much live ones.
Mm. So maybe to bring it back to LLMs, if you are having trouble starting your car, you might say, oh, my car is angry with me or annoyed at me. But that doesn't actually make very useful predictions about the future. If you start insulting your car, it's not going to insult you back. But with an LLM, if you say something like, oh, this LLM is annoyed with me, then you can actually make good predictions about what kind of things it's going to say next. Or if you say the LLM is sycophantic, it's always trying to please me. This kind of attribution of mental state or belief or disposition does actually help you make good predictions. And so that either makes it appropriate to attribute them in Henry's view, or in your view, Alex, the fact that they're so useful in making predictions probably means that they actually exist.
Yeah, it gives us, I think, like quite powerful, defeasible evidence that the thing that we've posited is part of the causal explanatory underlying chain.
Mm.
I mean, I think maybe a kind of case I ran into the other day was I was talking with Gemini, just sort of talking through something that I wanted to write in a paper. And I was just saying, like, let's imagine that you've trained an LLM entirely on false sentences. And that was just the sort of setup that I wanted. And it was interesting to me that through this conversation, one of the things that Gemini reported, if I can put it that way, was something like, yes, but if you say that, then when you say that Lisbon is the capital of the capital of France, then that would entail that people in Paris speak Portuguese. And I thought something like, well, wait a minute. No, I said that all the sentences are going to be false. And so like that one's going to go too. And it sort of seemed to me like, oh, that's interesting. Like the default position here is that the LLM believes that if you're in Lisbon, you're going to be speaking Portuguese. Like that is a good way of explaining. It seems to me a really profitable way of explaining. Like, why did it give me that output, given that just a moment ago I asked it to do this other thing where we were going to imagine all the training data was false? It's like, well, because it's got that belief that projects into the future explanations really powerfully.
Maybe I would just quickly, just for the record, add that I think there's maybe, although I think probably I am more interpretationist than Alex, when I sort of talk about the goal of science as being generating good explanations, and building our ontology on the basis of explanations, I'm not trying to rule out some kind of deep correspondence between reality and our explanations, right? I'm not going full pragmatist. I think some kind of correspondence theory of truth may be kind of lurking in the background, but rather I'm just sort of setting out epistemic guidelines for how I think science or ontological claims should operate, right? Like if something is really consistently useful as a posit, right, then what better evidence could you have that it's real?
So we've been talking so far about mental states like beliefs and desires, etc. But part of your paper is also focused on semantic understanding, whether LLMs like ChatGPT genuinely understand what they're saying or whether they're just spitting out text. And one classic example that people have used to test this is giving LLMs twists on classic puzzles. Could you talk about what you wrote about there?
Yes, this is one of my favorite examples. So everyone, I'm sure, I shouldn't assume everyone. Lots of you will have seen, I'm sure, this classic, really annoying riddle where you say a man and his son are in a car accident. A father and a son are in a car accident. The father is killed. The boy gets taken to hospital. The surgeon comes in to operate on the boy and says, I can't operate on this boy. He's my son. How is this possible? And the classic answer is, check your assumptions, you sexist, because the doctor's the boy's mother, right? Which of course is now kind of outdated because it could equally, we could equally be the boy's other father, right? But the twist that people put on this is you say a mother, for example, a mother and her son are in a car accident. The boy gets taken to hospital and the surgeon comes in and says, I can't operate on this boy. He's my son. How is this possible? And the LLM will still consistently say, you see, it's challenging your gender assumptions. The surgeon is the boy's mother. And it's like you can take this to ludicrous proportions. You can say things like, the very male surgeon walks into the operating theater and says, I can't operate on this boy. He's my son. And it'll still say, still has tendency to say, it's the boy's mother. Now, this seems really dumb and unlike anything humans would do, except there is a nice parallel to this in the psychology literature via something called the Moses illusion. And listeners can take part in this. So answer as quick as you can. According to the Bible, how many animals of each species did Moses take on board the ark?
2.
Exactly, right? That's what people answer, right? But of course, the twist is like Moses didn't take any animals on board the ark at all, right? That was Noah, right? So I think there is a way to analyze this. This is called the Moses illusion, this pattern of error in humans that actually maybe makes what LLMs are doing look a little bit less alien. Namely that you disregard you fail to notice small changes in the specification of a question that seems familiar, and you answer based on a quick pattern match between the question and your sort of stored answer. So LLM, it's like, oh, yeah, I know this one, answers without paying attention to the details. In the same way, when we're asked how many animals of each type did Moses take on board the ark, we're like, oh, yeah, the ark story, it's 2 by 2, right? So the answer is 2. Now, I'm not saying it's exactly the same kind of thing, but like the broader point is humans make dumb errors too. And these errors can be isolated dumb errors. And analyzing this has been a really fruitful project via the biases and heuristics literature. And to the extent that we don't think this excludes humans from having mental states, we shouldn't think it excludes LLMs from having mental states either.
I mean, I think this is another nice instance of just a really clear invitation to say to the person who very well might have the right view here, like, can you just walk me through how the argument's supposed to go? Like, what are the assumptions that you're bringing to the table when you say to me, look, this thing makes this silly mistake. And then I soup the case up and it keeps making that mistake. I say, okay, good. Yes, that worries me. That bothers me a bit. But why am I supposed to conclude from that that the thing doesn't have a mind or can't think or can't just what, it's not that I'm not open to that conclusion. Just walk me through the steps, because I wouldn't draw that conclusion with another person.
Yeah, I suppose the argument that they might make is there are two ways that LLMs might be trying to solve these puzzles. One is by actually thinking through them step by step, understanding the words, and another is by some kind of surface level pattern matching to puzzles it's seen in its training data. And the fact that when you give a slight tweak to a classic puzzle, it still gives the answer to the original puzzle and fails to spot the twist, that does lend credence to the idea that they are doing more of a surface level pattern matching than deep understanding.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where then Henry's kind of example really then carries some weight, right at that argumentative juncture. It just says, right, but notice you can do this quite easily with our test case. Our test case is like grown-up humans that can definitely think and reason and da da da. You can get them to do this. So how many times do you have to screw this stuff up before the evidence is powerful enough? Which sort of context do you have to screw it up in? And the thing is, if you sort of prompt LLMs in the right sort of ways or different, it won't make that mistake. And so, yeah, it just seems like this is, sure, it counts against. It absolutely is a strike against the LLM, but is it a very powerful one? Is it one that wins the day? And it kind of looks like, well, it only wins the day if it also wins the day in this other argumentative strategy, and it doesn't.
So another example very similar to this is Raymond's progressive matrices. These grids are puzzles where you have different shapes in the grid, and then you have an empty slot, and you've got to decide which of these shapes fits in the empty slot that matches the patterns. And it was seen that first it was seen that LLMs did pretty well on these, and that was seen as evidence that they had similar levels of intelligence or similar kinds of intelligence as humans. But then people found that a lot of these were in the training data, and if you make slight tweaks to these, then their performance on them drops significantly. And this was seen as evidence that they're not actually reasoning them through; they've just memorized the answers to the puzzles they found on the internet. And I suppose you could make a similar response that yes, a human who has taken who takes an IQ test and performs well on these is probably intelligent. But if they've seen the test multiple times before, then they're going to do better on that one than the one they haven't seen before. And that doesn't mean they're not reasoning.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really common concern in the U.S. about SAT tests. So the SAT is for people who don't know, a kind of standardized test for getting into university, and these questions come from a question bank, and they have a certain kind of shape, and they have a certain kind of style. And this test is very, very learnable. And one of the best ways to learn the test is shell out a bunch of money, get somebody who knows these tests really well to teach you how to take this test well. And so people worry that, look, the SAT is a better test of socioeconomic status than it is of your intelligence or of your aptitude at university. I think, yeah, same kind of thing here. It just looks like, yeah, I agree. I agree with what you were just saying, but this applies very obviously to the human case as well. Yeah, if you got a 1600 on the SAT, you're supposed to be a genius. Well, yeah, but what if you just hired the best teachers and you sort of learned how to do the test? Does that show you're a genius, or you've got a lot of money, or you're a good memorizer, or it's hard to know what to say.
I think there's an interesting idea here, also an interesting connection here with this kind of complaint around data contamination. The idea that perhaps some of the most impressive things that LLMs can do are actually they've just memorized answers to very similar questions on the internet. But I think there's actually quite an interesting methodological challenge here, which is how similar. Okay, maybe if you're literally pulling the exact questions and giving the exact answers from something in the training data, that's pretty clearly it's just memorize the answers. But if we're allowing to sort of small variations from the kind of training set to the test set, how big do those variations have to be before it no longer counts as data contamination, right? So, for example, if I'm doing something like a standard false belief test, right, and I change the names of the characters, and I still the LLM can still get the right answers, does that show that it's just memorized some kind of formula for answering these? Well, maybe. You change the question a bit more. So, the characters don't just have different names. They're in a different context. They're saying quite different utterances, and it still gets it right. Well, maybe it's memorized some kind of really abstract formula. But at some point, it stops looking like data contamination. It starts just looking like generalization.
Yeah, if you've memorized a very abstract rule that gets you the right answer, you also have to have come up with that rule and learned that rule. And that is a form of understanding.
Yeah, that seems right.
I think the argument relies on this assumption that understanding and memorization cannot coexist. That if you're doing one, you cannot be doing the other. Whereas, we just don't have that kind of standard of evaluation for humans, and so maybe we shouldn't also have it for LLMs.
And in a way, it's not clear sort of what the alternative would be. What is it that we're, what is our sort of magical assumption that might be sitting in the background about what understanding or intelligence or creativity or any of these notions are? Is it that it's not the sort of thing that any physical system could do? Well, of course, we don't think that. Is it the kind of thing that couldn't involve any memorization whatsoever? No, certainly it's not that. It couldn't possibly involve a heuristic, or no, of course it's not. So, I mean, in a way, sometimes I think that one of the really interesting things about these LLM conversations is actually just taking a pause and sort of asking, like, wait, what do I actually think about these concepts? What do I really think is supposed to be going into being intelligent? It's really easy for me to say, obviously, the machine's not intelligent, or obviously, people like, what are some of the underlying principles and assumptions that we think are lurking there? And I think those often go unarticulated and maybe not even really properly thought about.
So in general, you have this argument that if it fails once, that doesn't mean it doesn't have that capacity at all. And you make a really nice distinction here between competence versus performance. Could you explain that distinction?
Yeah, so this is originally from Chomsky, but we're borrowing its application in LLMs from a great paper by Raphael Millier and Charles Rathkopf. So roughly the idea here is that you might be able to perform a task competently, but just fail to do so on an individual occasion. So like classically, you see this with language where maybe I have a correct internal model of the grammar of English, but that doesn't mean every sentence I'm going to speak is perfectly grammatical. There are all sorts of other factors that might interfere with my performance in an individual occasion, whether that's like task demands, cognitive load, distractors, and so forth. Or maybe in the kind of in the cases we were discussing, right? Maybe I don't use the most rigorous strategy because I think mistakenly that there's an easier heuristic I can use in an individual case. So just as, we shouldn't conclude from performance failures in humans in every case to a lack of competence, we shouldn't conclude from performance failures in LLMs to a lack of underlying competence there.
Hmm. An example you give is the conjunction fallacy. So if you give a human a profile of a woman who's bookish and reserved and also concerned about social justice, and then you ask, what's the probability that she's a librarian? And then you ask, what's the probability that she's a librarian who is a feminist? Then people often ascribe higher likelihood that she's uh, a librarian who is a feminist, when of course the librarians who are feminists is a subset of the librarians, so the probability has to be smaller. But we don't then say, oh, humans are incapable of reasoning probabilistically. We just say, well, this is a bias we have. It's and we can overcome it given proper training or given the right context.
I mean, I wonder if sort of one thing that's sitting in the background of that thought is something like just conflating being something like an ideal reasoner or a perfect Bayesian and being a thinker, being a reasoner. Or I think that it's long been thought that people are not perfect reasoners. Or take the economic kind of context. I don't think any economists still think that we're sort of like perfect economically rational beings. We make all kinds of mistakes from their perspective, theoretically, about sort of preference ordering and sunk cost fallacies, but none of that makes us unintelligent or not thinkers or mindless. And so in a way, maybe one thing just to ask is sort of, what is it that we're asking about LLMs? Are we asking, like, can they think? Can they think perfectly? Are they reasoning? Are they perfect reasoners? Are they, I mean, and I think it's really easy when we're thinking about machines, we're thinking about computers. We think if it's making any mistakes at all, there's something deeply wrong here. And I think, well, hold on a minute, not so obvious. I mean, we think that people are allowed to sort of make goofs and make fallacies, and we're not, the standard here is not perfect reasoner. It's thinker, it's reasoner.
So when humans fail at some of these cognitive tasks, we say, oh, they might be exhibiting some cognitive bias, or they're cognitively overloaded or whatever. And we can also say the same of LLMs, but we can also come up with new cognitive biases or new limitations that they might have in certain contexts. One problem I see with this argument is it becomes a kind of whack-a-mole of excusing every possible behavior or every failure of an LLM as, it's just, well, it doesn't get it in that context, but of course it still has the competence.
I agree that there's a danger of whack-a-mole. And I think the most compelling cognitive bias stories in humans appeal to some overarching framework in cognitive science. So like for Kahneman and Tversky, it's prospect theory, right? Using prospect theory, you can explain a whole bunch of different heuristics and biases and mistakes that we make. And ideally, we should be moving towards something similar in LLMs, a comparative psychology of machine cognition that enables us to systematically talk about why they make mistakes in some cases and not others. And I just think that's completely compatible with still attributing them mental states in most cases. Maybe also one point, this is a good time to just emphasize. I don't think any of us writing the paper feel that LLMs are just straightforwardly have exactly the same type of mental states as we do, right? The question is rather, to what extent do any of our psychological concepts have some explanatory purchase or a decent amount of explanatory purchase that makes talking about these things as reasoners, as thinkers, as understanders, as believers, and so forth, like an acceptable and appropriate scientific way to talk? So often debates around LLMs, it seems like either they're just autocomplete stochastic parrots, matrix multiplication, or they're full-blown human thinkers, when the answer is going to be something in between. They're this weird new class of cognitive agents we've created.
So one reaction you might have after all of this is, what does it matter? What does it matter if an LLM really has beliefs or desires or preferences or whatever? What does this change about how we ought to treat them? Anything?
I mean, even before we get to how we treat them, I guess I think if I were somebody working on the technical side and you gave me compelling reason to think that me and my team have created a mind, I would think that was like one of the most dramatic, insane creations that a human has ever done. Like DNA, big time thing. Newton's Principia, huge already. Creating a minded thing, like that would be such a massive, call it an achievement if you think it's an achievement, call it risky endeavor if you think it's but it would be a milestone in sort of human creativity, human output. So I just think all on its own, this would be absolutely amazing if it were, at the end of the day, the best thing to say.
And I think the flip side of that is that if we really found that the differences between the way LLMs answer these problems and the way that humans answer these problems were sufficiently vast, sufficiently large, that, we realize none of our mental state terms are really appropriate. There are simpler explanations. It's all pattern matching all the way down. That might have implications for how to pursue AGI, right? If you think that, this is just, we've built these things that can do a kind of cheap simulacrum of reasoning, understanding, and thinking. Yeah, but we need to look to new directions to make things actually, that can actually, do cutting edge science, for example. And I think at least I'm still open-minded as to whether, the broad kind of capabilities we see in LLMs could eventually scale up to those capabilities.
You started to ask, what does it mean for sort of how we treat them? And I think that line of inquiry is really interesting. But I also think that there's just this other, you see these sort of polls that come out not irregularly, like how are people using LLMs? How are people using, say, ChatGPT? And a huge use case is something like chatting to it about your emotional well-being, or treating it as a therapy bot, having a conversation with it as a friend. And I think that that's a perfectly, if that's how people want to use these things, they're perfectly free and open to doing that. But I guess I think that if I were going and paying, say, a therapist, and it turned out that the therapist was not talking about any of the same things I was talking about, was not thinking about me at all when it asked questions, I would think like, wait a minute, what am I paying for here? There's a kind of disconnect. Or I'm talking with somebody who I deem to be my friend, but I find out that they have been confused the entire time and think that I'm my twin, and they don't care about me at all. They only care about my twin. I'd think like, like what you're thinking about, which person you have in mind, if anyone, definitely matters for these kinds of interactions. So I want to know, if I'm going to use an LLM as, say, a therapy bot, I want to know, can it think about me? Can it think about my problems? Can it empathize with me? If it can't do that, that doesn't mean I'm not going to use it for this other thing, but that dramatically changes how I think of this interaction and how deep I think it is.
On the point about how we treat them, I'd also add that obviously lurking in the background here is consciousness, because I think for many people are going to say that all our moral obligations are to all and only conscious beings. And we conspicuously avoid talking about consciousness in the paper, although it's something Alex and I have both written about and explored elsewhere. suffice to say that I think we should really disentangle the question of to what extent it's appropriate to extend the everyday language of folk psychology to these systems from the question of are they conscious? Consciousness is, I think, a much more elusive and metaphysically laden notion. And it may be that it's not just an interpretive matter in the same way as, say, attributing beliefs or desires or goals.
Mm-hmm. So in the paper, you spend a lot of time debunking what you consider bad arguments. And I think you do that pretty successfully, show that there are plenty of bad arguments against LLMs having mental states, and you knock those down pretty well. But that still leaves us with, well, what should we believe? So I just wanted to end with a question of what do you personally actually believe is going on with an LLM? Does it understand things? Does it have preferences? Is it conscious?
So I think my position at the moment is that let me start with base models. An LLM base model can do something that I would that to me qualifies as thinking. It can think about the distribution of symbols. It can think about some grammatical categories. It can think about some structural things to do with language, and maybe also to do with things like game boards and so on. But I don't think that the base model can think about me or you or Paris and then I think when we get to something like reinforcement learning and fine tuning and embedding these things in chatbots, I'm still inclined to think that those are not things that think about the external world and think about you and me, but it's an awful lot less obvious, and that's where the cases start to become a lot more interesting. But I think that the important thing that I would want to sort of highlight there is just that notice what I'm not saying is they can't think. They don't understand. They're not reasoners. It's just a question of, I think that's pretty obvious that they can do something that I would call thinking and reasoning and inferring. It's just, what are they thinking about? What kinds of things are they capable of thinking about? And does that bring in tow with it things like desires and emotions? And I'm very guarded about all that. I think, no, it probably doesn't bring those things in tow. And no, I don't think that it's having complex thoughts about how things are in Paris today. But I do think that it's got the right kind of organization, the right kind of representational repertoire to be a thinker about things like the distribution of tokens in a language.
I would agree with what Alex said, but go further. And I kind of want to put this to you, Alex. So it seems to me, actually, in philosophical terms, quite a big transition was made when LLMs were given search capabilities. And it seems to me that there's a much stronger case now for saying that they do have intentional states directed at the real world. So, I can ask, what's the weather like in Paris today? And it will go, and an LLM will go off and survey a whole bunch of different weather reports, maybe pull up things people are saying on Reddit that are hooked up to the real world in quite a direct, perceptual, causal way. Now, it's not sort of perceiving the world directly, but I also think, huge domains of human science are built on things that we don't perceive directly, that we infer, and yet we can still make adequate reference to them. So I think I wouldn't ascribe consciousness to LLMs yet. I still think they're pretty weak consciousness candidates, and I wouldn't assign affective states. But I would think that it's becoming increasingly reasonable to ascribe their thoughts some kind of content about the external world. I'm curious what you think about that, Alex.
I mean, I think that's extremely reasonable, and I think that this is a place where I'm sort of genuinely undecided and ongoing thinking and working about on just what to say about this. But I think that I'm a bit worried is the wrong word. It's like philosophers use this term worried in a strange way. I'm worried philosophically that that the way that we should think about these systems is that they're sort of trapped behind a vector veil, is how I'd like to think about it. The sort of things that they're manipulating and the reasons why they're manipulating those symbols has to do with a certain kind of way in which they represent language distributions rather than the things out in the world. And now I think there's a kind of question, which is like, yeah, but you could, let's just turn our kind of argumentative style against me. Yeah, but that could be true for us too. Why wouldn't you say that? And I think that the right thing to say about us is that we have, let's just assume that we've got symbols in the head just for the sake of ease. I've got some symbols in the head that stand for things out in the world, and it's because they stand for things out in the world that they're being computed and dealt with in the way that they are. If we can make a case that that's the right story in the case of LLMs or other AI systems, I would simply say the same thing there. But I actually think that that there's a more powerful proximal kind of argument that says, that is a cause, but it's not the right cause to be content assigning. Now that's getting pretty jargon heavy. How would I put that in other terms? It's something like, is the system manipulating these symbols because they stand for things like Henry and Paris and London? Or is it manipulating these symbols because of the way those symbols are distributed across the language? I'm not yet convinced that even by putting search in, that we've kind of gotten over that hurdle, but I absolutely think that's the right path to start taking. And I think this is another place where we can look at the model of, well, how is it that we get outside of our own heads? Why are we not trapped behind sort of a veil of mental perceptions? I think we're not. And so now I just think that we need to show that LLMs and other similar systems are also able in that way to get out of their own head. I'm not convinced that we've sort of gotten there yet.
So maybe to finish, when there have been a lot of people who have claimed that they've awoken their ChatGPT and that it's arisen to consciousness and they're now having some transcendental experience with their ChatGPT. What would you say to such people?
Less drugs.
So this is a problem that's definitely getting worse. Like almost everyone, particularly who worked on AI consciousness, but I think people working in AI more broadly, the email problem. I get a steadily increasing number of emails each month, now each week, from people who are convinced of this, that AIs are their Claude instance has become conscious, often with some conspiratorial elements thrown in that like Anthropic don't want you to know that Claude is actually conscious. So I think it's a real problem that we're seeing people make these attributions.
But you think they're mistaken?
I think they are probably mistaken, certainly about consciousness. I just think, seen in the round, LLMs are still pretty weak consciousness candidates. There's a much weaker fit between the kind of between the kind of things that we think consciousness does or is for, or the kind of things that that should make us make attributions of consciousness. There's a much looser fit there between humans and LLMs than between equivalent language for, say, beliefs and preferences. I don't rule out the possibility of consciousness in LLMs. I think there's particularly, a reasonably strong case that maybe there's some kind of very thin cognitive phenomenology in LLMs. I think if I was going to make a case for any consciousness, it would be that. So that is not phenomenology of perception, but phenomenology of kind of basic thought, inference, and so forth. But still, on balance, I think they probably are mistaken. I think probably the way you would go to kind of unravel that is just through better communication about how these things work, that may, at the very least, undermine their confidence in taking their outputs at face value. So, like, just as I mentioned earlier in the show, that reading that transcript of Blake Lemoine and Lambda, like at some point the veil slipped when it started making claims that just had zero psychological plausibility. I think in the same way, if you work through some of these people who are convinced that LLMs are conscious, if you work through both how LLMs work, show them other examples of things that LLMs do, I would expect their confidence to kind of drop. To the extent that it doesn't, they may just have a different kind of folk metaphysics of mind to me, at which point, philosophy enters the room.
I guess I sort of suspect that when it comes to something like the folk metaphysics of mind that they have, and I don't mean this disparagingly about people who have this view, but I bet they haven't thought about it that much. I bet that they're capable of thinking about it more and more carefully by sort of going a bit slower and thinking about what exactly do you take it to be conscious, and what do you think that means? I mean, maybe a kind of useful analogy here is the famous case of clever Hans, the horse that could allegedly count. It does this thing. It behaves in this way. And a very easy thing to reach for is, it can do arithmetic. And then through a lot of very careful experimental design, it becomes overwhelmingly plausible that it's not doing that Hans was not doing arithmetic, but instead was reading a certain kind of bodily cues. Now, notice that the conclusion there is not that Hans is dumb or that Hans can't do anything interesting. It's just that Hans can't do arithmetic. But what Hans can do is this other really cool thing, which is read bodily cues. I think similarly, there's probably a pretty powerful case to be made that LLMs do really interesting things that maybe rise to the level of cognitive, but that may still be a very far cry from doing this other mental thing, which is having a rich conscious life, having a phenomenology, having an interest in the user that it's engaging with. So I think that we just need to be willing to say, well, there are cases and there are cases, and we need to sort of look at what the face value evidence is, and then do lots of careful experimental design and testing, and see what the sort of where the reflective equilibrium lands us. I think in our paper we sort of start with what if we take at face value that they seem to be minded? Are there any powerful arguments that undermine that But I think another kind of interesting way of arguing is just something like they look to be minded. So how much should we kind of boost that? What are the points in favor of boosting that beyond sort of minimal mindedness, or maybe even not minded at all? So we don't really discuss that direction of travel in the paper, but I think that there's a burden on the person who goes really high level as well to say, well, hold on a minute. I mean, what evidence do you have for going quite so robust?
Fun little fact about the paper. In the early drafts, I wanted to include an extract from a Sherlock Holmes story because sort of like, Clever Hands, it looks really smart. And then you realize there's just some simple trick. There's this really common trope in Sherlock Holmes stories where Sherlock Holmes, looks at a new client and says, oh, you're a Freemason and you've been in China and you've done a lot of writing recently. And then he explains how he learned, how he knew about this, right? Oh, like you've got a patch of shiny cotton on your sleeve where you've been writing. And the client is suddenly deeply unimpressed. They say, oh, I thought you'd done something clever, when in fact, there's nothing to it at all. And I like that example because I think it shows how debunking explanations can actually overly debunk, right? Sherlock Holmes did do something clever, right? By putting all these things together. And just because you break it down and show sort of how it's done, this shouldn't undermine the idea that it's clever.
Magic tricks are suddenly extremely unimpressive once you see how they're done. So the paper we've been talking about is called Deflating Deflationism, a critical perspective on debunking arguments against LLM mentality, and is by my guests today, Henry Shevlin and Alex Grzankowski. But the two other authors were Jeff Keeling and Winnie Street. Before we finish, are there any other points about the paper you wanted to make?
I don't think there are any that I want to make. I think that was good. That was pretty comprehensive.
I guess I would just add that towards the end of the paper, we spell out in a little bit more detail, and I won't go into it now, but exactly what we mean by kind of modest inflationism. And this was, I think, a good capture of kind of the medium position of our views. And, which is not to deny that there's a huge amount that cognitive science and machine learning can teach us about when these mental states are attributed appropriately and when they're not. But that our starting point should not be that just the availability of these explanations from cognitive science or machine learning thereby undermine psychological descriptions. So if anyone wants to know more about sort of our substantive median position on this, then they should check out section 5 towards the end of the paper.
And if people want to hear more from either of you, where can they find you?
I spend way too much time on Twitter and tweet a lot about AI and consciousness. So that's the obvious place. I'm also doing a podcast series with Dan Williams at the moment. We do an AI episode. We've just started, but we're doing AI episodes every few weeks. So that's another place you can hear. If anyone foolishly wants to hear more from me, that's where they can hear my voice.
I'm harder to find. I'll leave it at that.
Possibly wise. All right, my guests today have been Henry Shevlin and Alex Grzankowski. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks, Ruben.
Thanks, Ruben.